Grant in Wilson has asked this. He puts it rather straightforwardly. I suspect Grant himself may be something of a skeptic, but says, Tom, why are you still trotting out apologetics about women's testimony supporting the historicity of the resurrection accounts? The argument has been soundly debunked with evidence, and at this point adds a link to an article by Richard Carrier, who's a well-known skeptic, in fact a Jesus mythicist. I think someone you probably have bumped into the writings of before. And I know you've had a chance to just briefly look at this article that's mentioned. First of all, maybe sketch out the way you have seen as significant the fact of the women in the empty tomb in that historical setting. And then, if you would, sketch out what you believe to be the problems that Carrier has with it.
I have to say, I have looked at one or two of Carrier's things. I hadn't looked at this one until you sent me these questions, and I thought, what's he on about this time? And he, it's fair enough to poke and prod at the historical arguments. I would always be up for that. History really, really, really matters. And if he says that the texts don't mean what I say they mean, then I really want to know about that. I don't want to sweep that under the carpet in any way. What I have tended to say, as one of several reasons for supposing that the resurrection stories in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John are really early, this is even though the Gospels were probably attaining their final form by the 60s or 70s or 80s. We really don't know that, but let's assume that they were. The resurrection stories themselves do not show all the signs you might expect of being from that period. They show the signs of being really early. One of the reasons is the absence of Old Testament exegesis there, whereas in the crucifixion story there's a lot of that. Another is the absence of the Christian future hope. Elsewhere in the Gospels it says, Jesus is risen from the dead, therefore we will be raised from the dead. The resurrection stories don't say that. They say Jesus is risen from the dead. Therefore, oh my goodness, this was unexpected. Yes. Maybe he's the Messiah and we have a job to do. But then one of the other reasons is that in all four stories, especially in John, the women are front and center. And the problem with that is that in the ancient world, women were not regarded as credible witnesses for all sorts of reasons. And that's what Carrier is pushing back at. But in order to contextualize that, we need to contrast those stories in the Gospels with the official formula which Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 15 when he says the Messiah died for our sins according to the Scriptures, was buried, was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and was seen by, and we say, well, Mary Magdalene, the other Mary, Joanna. No. He gives us a list of the people who saw him. They're all men. This is written, and it's summarizing a tradition in the early 50s. If that's already the tradition which Paul says this is what we all preached, then this is a tradition which has taken shape by the late 40s at the earliest. Now, if that was the early tradition, and this is the point that I'm making, which I think Carrier doesn't quite understand, then if you were writing up resurrection stories later and you wanted to beef up this tradition a bit, would you invent stories about women?
Would you introduce them at that stage?
Would you introduce them at that stage? And historically, it is far, far more likely that they were in the story from the beginning, and that because of anxieties about how credible this would be,
they got a bit airbrushed
They got airbrushed out of the tradition. And a passage that Carrier doesn't mention, as far as I can see in that article, maybe he's discussed it somewhere else, is that in the middle of the 2nd century, there's a skeptic called Celsus who is opposing Christianity, and we know about him because the great church father called Origen wrote against him, Contra Celsum, and Celsus says sneeringly, it's all based on the testimony of one hysterical woman. And it's quite clear, and various people have pointed out, that the language used there is not just hysterical in general. Hysterical is a word people used about women. But then the other things which Carrier goes for, which Grant here, I'm not sure whether Wilson is where he lives or his surname possibly.
But
anyway,
sure.
Grant.
He entered it as the place. So.
Okay, right, okay. But anyway, Grant, what Carrier does is to pick up 3 passages from the rabbis, which I had referred to. By the way, when I made this point in The Resurrection of the Son of God, I gave it precisely 2 pages, because the book was already 700 pages long. You could have expanded it a lot more. And there's been, since I wrote that book, which is 17 years ago now, there's been a lot of work done on Jewish law courts and so on. And it appears that particularly later on in the rabbinic period, women could be admissible for giving evidence. But there's one passage where it's in the technical term is in the Mishnah, which is roughly 200 AD, and in the Mishnah tractate called Rosh Hashanah, the New Year's Day, 1:8, Carrier agrees that for many people, as evidenced by that passage, he says a woman's judgment was inherently questionable, but not her honesty. And I want to say, but that's exactly the point. It was her judgment that would make people say, no, we mustn't do that. So Carrier is implying that I'm saying that a woman's honesty was in doubt. And I'm saying, no, it's just that people constantly said you can't trust women. And the passage which he does quote and discuss, but which seems to be the direct disproof of what Carrier says when he says that there is no such tradition about women's testimony not being acceptable, is from Josephus. Josephus is writing just after Paul, around the same time as most people think the Gospels are being written. And in Antiquities Book 4, when he's describing the legal processes in Deuteronomy, he says three things very clearly. First, the testimony of one person isn't valid, you must have 2 or 3 witnesses. Second, women are not acceptable witnesses in a law court, and he gives a reason. And then thirdly, slaves are not acceptable in a law court because they may be afraid or they may be being bribed. So what are the reasons for why the women are not acceptable? And Josephus says very explicitly, that the Greek is gunaikon de me esto martyria, no evidence from a woman or from women. And he says because of 2 things, their levity and their boldness. Levity, kufates in Greek, and thrasos, which means over boldness or rashness. And Carrier tries to say, this doesn't mean that their evidence isn't acceptable. It just means that if you let women in a law court, they'll be giggling and laughing and scolding and so on. And that flies in the face of the very careful legal way that Josephus has laid that out. And what it clearly means is that Josephus regarded, and Jews of his day, regarded women as empty-headed, trivial people who couldn't think straight and always liable to jump to rash conclusions and to blurt things out, so you couldn't trust them. And at the same time, the other great Jewish writer of the time, Philo, discussing a passage in Genesis and allegorizing it, he says, the female sex is irrational, akin to bestial passions, fear, sorrow, pleasure, and desire, from which ensue incurable weaknesses and indescribable diseases. And now, I have to say, I quoted some of this to my wife last night over supper, and it kept her angry for the whole of the meal. These men, how dare they say? I said, that's not the point. I said, the point is, this is what people thought at the time, and yet the Gospels put the women front and center. And there are other passages as well, and Carrier is quite rude about me and other apologists at this point, and says, you don't bother to check your sources. But actually, I refer in the passage in question to a discussion by my friend Richard Borkham in his book Gospel Women, where he discusses this issue, and he points out a very interesting passage in the book we call Pseudo-Philo, which is, like Josephus, a summary of biblical history, where at one point Miriam, the older sister of Moses, has a dream, and in her dream she dreams that her mother is going to give birth to a son who will redeem Israel. And when she tells her parents in the morning, they don't believe her. Even though it was true, and Pseudo-Philo knows it's true. And as Borkham says, this shows this is the normal assumption. And guess what? In the parallel passage when Josephus is describing the birth of Moses, it's Moses' father who has the dream, and he is believed. Right. And so it's not so much, is there a strict law here? It's that the widespread assumption. And so, again, I say, granted the tradition in 1 Corinthians, if you were going to make up stories later, would you do it like that? And the answer is absolutely no. Those must be original, very close up to the facts.
Well, I have no doubt that Carrier will respond to that.
Best of luck.
We'll see how much tennis gets going in the process. But thank you. Really, really helpful. Really interesting to hear it explained in those terms.
For podcast episodes, bonus content, and to ask your question, sign up at askntwright.com.